Now, number 3, well, cholecystitis is a condition. Superative tells us a little more about that particular cholecystitis. But now let's move down to 9 through 15. And here you can see we're looking at procedures. And once again, we're looking up the procedure itself, not the anatomical site. I think that you're pretty close on everything there. Let's move over to page 38 and 39 with the exercises, and let's see, have you got any questions about any one of those? Are there any that you feel you need to do in class? Did you understand them when you did? Have you done them? Okay. Do you need to redo them? Everybody okay? All right. They're pretty easy. Let's move to chapter 6. Second paragraph there, use both the alphabetic indexes and the tabular list. They're just telling you that again. Assign codes to the highest level of detail. We went over that the first night, didn't we? I always take it to the furthest degree possible. 42, assign residual codes. Your NEC and your not otherwise specified. We talked about them last week, and we know that very often you'll be talking about a code that ends in a 0.8 or a 0.9. The very fact that they end in a 0.8 or a 0.9 is your trigger to say, oh, could I be more specific? You may not be able to be more specific, and you may have to put it in the 0.8 or 0.9, and if so, it's okay. But it is a sign to you that, oh, this maybe I can be a little more specific. Let me try. Take a look at the second sentence. This code should never be assigned without a careful review of subterms to determine whether a more specific code can be located. So anytime you see NEC, anytime you see NOS, that is a flag for you to try to find a more specific code if you can, but you may not have enough documentation to be able to do so. Combination codes. These are single codes that classify two diagnoses or a diagnosis with an associated condition, and that's a combination code. You've been given some examples. Acute cholecystitis with cholelithiasis. Well, if you start looking that one up, you're going to look it up first under cholecystitis, aren't you? And then it's going to tell you with cholelithiasis and give you one code. And the same thing with acute pharyngitis due to streptococcal infection. You're going to look up both things, but when both things lead you to one code, then that's going to tell you that that one code is adequate. Now, are you comfortable with those, or do you want to look up a couple of them? Did you look them up as you did them? No. Let's look them up. Let's look at the acute cholecystitis with cholelithiasis. What are your conditions? Those two things. Which one am I going to look up first? Well, to make it easier on myself, I'm going to look up the first one listed. So I'm going to look up cholecystitis. I'm real big about looking it up in the order in which it's given to you. That way you're not as apt to forget something. So I go to cholecystitis, and then I see with calculus. Wait a minute. What is cholelithiasis? Is lithiasis infection?
Oh, no,
that's a stone. Oh, well, I must have a stone then, hadn't I? So with a calculus, stones in the bile duct, see choledocholithiasis. If stones are in the gallbladder, see cholelithiasis. Well, irises are in the gallbladder, so it tells me to see cholelithiasis. So then I move down to cholelithiasis, and then the very first thing is with cholecystitis, and then underneath that, acute, and that's where my 574.0 came from. I do have a fifth digit because of the obstruction. But notice how I ended up looking at both. Well, if I had gone to cholelithiasis first, then I'd have gotten with cholecystitis. I might have gotten the code a little bit easier, but I wouldn't have been sure maybe whether I had the cholecystitis, so I could have gone and looked up the cholecystitis and it would have taken me right back. When you're not sure whether you code something or not, look it up. If it leads you right back to where you were, then you know that that one code is sufficient. Does that make sense? All right, let's look at acute pharyngitis due to streptococcal infection. Our key word or our condition is pharyngitis. I went to that one first because it's the first one listed. All right, pharyngitis, acute. Acute is one of those non-essential modifiers in parentheses. So now I'm going to try to find one that deals with streptococcal. Oh, and I come down the subterms, and do I find streptococcal? I do indeed, and that's an 034.0, indicating to me that in this instance, one code would have been enough because the book directed me into that. So it's actually much easier than it appears. All right, but did we hear? Yes and no. You've made a very good point. Now let's go back and try to code that infectious organism. So we go to infection. And what was the name of our infection? Strep. And this was a pharyngitis. So I get the strep infection. And under that, there's generalized, there's group, we don't know which group it is, then there's pneumonia, septicemia, and sore throat. Well, this patient had pharyngitis. Would that not be sore throat? And what code do you come up with? The very same thing. So see what I mean? When you're not sure, take that approach, try to code it, and if you come up with the same code, you know, okay, that's enough. I did it. And what that particular example is that pharyngitis, that strep, just gets coded to the streptococcal infection rather than the throat itself. Okay. The one combination code. All right. Assign multiple codes as needed on page 43. Multiple coding is the use of more than one code to fully identify a component element of a complex diagnostic or procedural statement. You should be guided by the directions in the tabular list for use of an additional code or codes that may require need more specificity. So when it tells you to use an additional code, do so. A little while ago, off camera, we looked up BPH and with urinary retention, and we saw that it had use additional code for urinary retention. We let the book guide us. If we had not looked that up in the tabular, would we have likely known to have done that? No. All right, mandatory multiple coding. This is a dual classification you were talking about. All right, dual classification describes the required assignment of two codes to provide information about both a manifestation and the associated underlying disease. An example, remember the diabetic cataract? When we look up diabetic cataract, do we find square brackets? And we know that the terms, the code in square brackets can never be our principal diagnosis code. But in that instance, we'd have mandatory dual classification because we've got to code the diabetes and we've got to code the cataract. And which one's going to be the principal? The diabetes is. All right, well, let's read it on. Mandatory multiple coding is identified in the alphabetic index by the use of a second code in brackets. So that diabetic cataract, once again, falls right into this. The first code identifies the underlying condition and